It's about that time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to City Views. We'd like to thank Toth Insurance Agency, located at 1151 East Main Street. Better protection, better value. And we also want to take this opportunity to thank our newest sponsor, Sullivan Automotive. See sullivanautomotive.com for an incredible selection of factory-certified, pre-owned, used cars, trucks, and SUVs. Sullivan Automotive, driving our community. We want to thank them for their faith and confidence in coming on board with City Views. Today, we are continuing our segments on meeting the candidates, and today we have Paul Cavagnero with us. Paul, good afternoon. How are you?
Terrific. How are you doing?
Very well. So nice to finally be able to interview you, though.
Yeah, we both had a rocky couple of months, I would say, in our personal lives. So glad to be here, Jacque.
Definitely. Now, Paul, I want you to talk a little bit to our audience about your desire and your passion for running and serving the citizens and residents of Torrington, Connecticut.
Sure. I began my political career in 2004 running for the Board of Education. I come from a long line. I can't say a long line. My father was involved, not in politics, but well, to the extent that he was on the Board of Education, I guess he was in politics. But I grew up in a family where education was always extremely important. You know, it's part of the overall, immigrant story in this country, and most certainly in the city, that the path forward is through education. So I learned to value that. I learned to respect it. And, my personal family life, it was a very, very high priority. And so after a rather circuitous route through the broadcast industry in Los Angeles and New York, I came back to Torrington when, after a divorce, I got custody of my two kids. They were 2 and 5 years old. And after a few years, I was asked by John Pelchett, who was at the time principal of Southwest School, if I'd like to get involved more with education, because I was, as a parent showing up to a lot of meetings and things. And I said, sure. And that got me into Board of Ed work, where I was there for 10 years. And I don't know how deeply we want to get into that. I was chairman for 5, and my experience literally on the board, it was extremely interesting and very thought-provoking, in the sense that I came to realize that public education now was very, very different than when I was in school. When Torrington, when the whole society culture and certainly the educational model was very simple and straightforward, and year after year was kind of the same thing: reading, writing, arithmetic, push the kids through, teachers retire, replace that teacher, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Over the years, and I think in my personal opinion, beginning back in the 90s, there was a real push to address the problems of poverty and children of poverty in our schools, because clearly they brought a lot of baggage that other kids did not. And so an awful lot of the breakdown of family and the lack of cohesion in our sort of society in general was reflected literally in the classrooms, and the inability of kids to stay focused, to have the kind of parental support back home that was, extremely instrumental in success. I know it wasn't my family, and every family I knew, and I would assume yours too, Jacque, that you're, from what I know about your father and your parents, they made it important too. And when a teacher said, to the parents, your son needs to pay attention more in class, your son needs to pay attention more to his homework, your son does it, the parents tended to support that overwhelmingly. And there was concern, and there were, at-home remediation techniques in place to support what the school and what the teacher was doing. And in this newer generation, that's not necessarily the case. And I don't want to get into details, but at the end of the day, what I experienced on the Board of Education was that an awful lot of social issues, that required more additional support for kids in terms of counseling, in terms of family counseling, personal counseling, in terms of catching up with their homework, and the very simplest of things in terms of just having books in the house. Those things were largely were pushed into the school system. And as a result, we started to see more and more an education system that was doing a lot of what typically was social service work inside of the school budget and inside of the school system. And it became, in my personal experience, in my opinion, it became more and more, or let me rephrase it, it became less and less manageable, okay, as a specific set of educational problems. And I focused hard on that in my time on the board. We're trying to get initiatives in place. And I don't want to go too deeply into that at this point, because there's probably a lot of other things you want to talk about. I could, I've put many people to sleep, and I've closed down a number of bars in Torrington, talking to people about my views about public education. So I will forbear on that for now, and just say that at the end of the 10-year term there, I started to feel like maybe I could address these problems more from the city council side. And that's literally where I was back in whenever it was 2014, when I first ran for city council. And literally my intent, Jacque, of running for city council was to focus on education, to try to bring together the educational people, right, the experts, and the city council and the mayor's office and the appropriate people there, and try to have a consistent and ongoing dialogue about these problems. Because to my mind, I admit, 10 years of board of work, I became convinced that the problems in public education were not tied and specific to education alone and to the educational system. They were now city problems that had to do with the long-term goal of what we want our educational system to be for all of our children, for future development of our town. And so that's why I segued into city council work. And it's still the focus of what I'm doing now. And quite frankly, if I think your next question is about why am I running again? I'm running again because, quite frankly, I feel frustrated that I have not been able to get the traction, Jacque, that I would like to at the council. To people who don't know, and this is quickly, I apologize to you. This is your show, and I know it's quickly becoming very boring, but to people who don't know, typically the education, but the Board of Education budget is separate and apart from the city government. That bifurcation of budgets was done a long, long time ago, 60 or 70 years ago. And there was a reason for that. They wanted to keep politics out of the Board of Education work, okay? It's a follow-up from the McCarthy era and a lot of things where people said, no, this should be a whole entity unto itself, strictly for teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, math. Fine, that made sense 70 years ago. But clearly now, social needs, social problems have become embedded within our schools, and that bifurcation, that wall between these two entities, to me makes no sense. It literally makes no sense. And I will carry this further. One of the reasons, again, one of the areas I'm most focused on city council, Jacque, is I have this very strong feeling that one of the real key things, one of the real key areas that we need to focus on to bring economic development to Torrington is fundamentally reevaluating our education system, looking at how we're delivering education. And it's not just the bricks and mortar. I agree we need a new high school. I think that's all great. I would have preferred that we waited 1 year to see how remote learning could impact us and we could do differently, because I think there's, especially once Microsoft, bought Zoom, they were going to invest a ton of money into it and make it this really robust sort of usable feature that is completely and effortlessly sort of, usable in a school environment. And I think there's just tremendous things that could be learned. I just wanted to see, I was hoping that we could incorporate all the knowledge that was learned from remote learning for that year and say, okay, now here's what the school should look like as a new brick and mortar school. Let's do things a little differently here, smarter, and get our to really drive our kids to get the skills that they will need for this new digital economy. So bottom line is, I hope I've answered your question. I began specifically trying to make an impact on public education. I quickly learned that so many of the problems and the key problems with our public education system have to do with the fact that now we're doing an awful lot of social services within our schools, and we need to be a lot clearer and more focused. You cannot just ask teachers to solve all of these incredible social problems. And that kind of is where we kept landing time and time again, is trying to retrain teachers to do social service work within the classroom while they're having all these other distractions in a 45-minute education block. And it made no sense to me. So that's why I'm running again. That is one of the areas I will continue to focus on the city council, is trying to. I've been unable to, because the current administration, well, quite frankly, I think they don't agree with me. They think, education should be left to itself to solve its own problems. We should focus on the city. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I think if you want to attract new businesses to Torrington and families to Torrington, I think one of the clearest, simplest ways to do that is to make an educational system where people say, you know what they're doing in Torrington? And I have some very specific ideas. I just don't have, I have some very specific ideas of what could be done to add to our curriculum. It's not, no one has to feel like their jobs are threatened. There's just, if you want to talk about this later, I'm more than happy to do it. It's a kind of a niche conversation, but I do have very specific things that I think could be implemented in Torrington. And I'll be honest with you, I retired recently. Prior to that, I was the last, 18 years at ESPN. And part of what I was working on at ESPN as just one of the, they have this yearly competition for submitting new ideas to somehow expand the scope and the range and the reach of ESPN as a network. And one of my last ideas that got pretty far up the food chain there had to do with working in partnership with our schools. And there's I have an idea that I would love to work on if I were reelected, to see if we could do that. Because I know there's some interest on the ESPN side. I'm not going to promise there's a lot of, it's a big organization, ESPN, and they're all about, they have to make their money. And I'm not sure this doesn't immediately tie to that, but it has legs, and long term, I think there might be some real support there. So that's what I'm about.
Well, Paul, I've attended some city council meetings in the past, and you've always been a proponent of innovation, trying to do things in a new and different way to garner different results. And I think that type of forward-leaning thinking is a major component to overcoming some of the challenges that we're seeing, especially in the educational system that we have today.
Without a doubt, Jacque. Without a doubt. We can't keep doing what we've been doing. We're in Alliance School District now, okay? 4 years ago, whenever it was, the state of Connecticut said you are now, they deemed us. What an Alliance School District identification means the state of Connecticut said, we give you a lot of money every year, and they do, to help with, with a lot of our, again, larger social issues to help support us. It goes to what's called the ECS formula, which is to try to somehow level the playing field between schools so that, ultimately you can produce the same level of expertise and quality education between poor towns and wealthier towns. Very smart, very good legislation. It gets more and more complicated every year. But at the end of the day, they finally determined that we were so far short of missing the mark of what they consider to be a successful school system that you get deemed an alliance. And that means the state is telling us, we are going to enter, you take a dime from us, and we are going to enter into an alliance with you. And we are going to tell you pretty much how to spend that money, because so far on your own, not so great. So there's a lot of work to be done, okay? And I'm not trying to blame any one group. This is a very complex, public education is a very complex beast now, okay? But to your point, and thank you for bringing this up, I do think we have to really look at it. I just think there are some really exciting new ways of looking at what we can do. And I am frustrated, I'll use that term, with many generations of superintendents who don't want to really step back and say, how could we do this differently in certain key areas? One example, okay? that gets to my frustration, because I don't know, Jacque, you're one of the few people that's actually taking, and over the years when we've talked about this, taking this seriously. My daughter's an educator, very proud of her. She started out in Boston and then went to Los Angeles. She works in East LA in a very poor school district, and they're doing gangbusters. They're killing it. They're doing better than most any other school, private or otherwise. It has to do with the approach to education, the people that they get. But you know what? Last year she was asked to get involved with, and I'd been talking to her about this, a partnership with Amazon. You say, well, what the hell's Amazon got to do with public education? Amazon is sponsoring a coding curriculum within her school. Okay. She and some of her administrators started reaching out to do some private, public, some partnerships. Amazon bit. And I said, yeah, we're thinking about doing the same thing. We're going to be doing this in a number of schools. Why don't you apply? They applied. They're getting money from Amazon to do code. Now, Amazon, they're a private business. They're for money, but they're looking long-term. That's what big corporations do. Right, Jacque? You've been around, that's what ESPN does. They're looking long-term at their product. They're saying, what do we need? And they're seeing gaps. And what Amazon is seeing is that in the United States, we are way, way, way behind Europe and Asia, okay? And how we're teaching coding in our schools. And that is by far, this, Jacque, that is the future. That is where the jobs are for our kids and our grandkids. It's not just being hardcore Steve Jobs. Well, he wasn't really a coder, but the hardcore coding. Yeah, the brilliant kids can do that. But there's tons of, again, at ESPN in the digital area, there's tons and tons and tons of, IT support and IT related and coding related jobs that are very well paying. They're very, very in demand. They're portable. You can work from home. You can work from any city, any town. They're the kind of jobs you want your kids to have. And there's a lot of them. And ESPN, like so many other corps, has to go overseas to bring in kids. Amazon was looking at that and they said, well, clearly it's a data-driven, metric-driven company. And they're saying, well, we should, we're going to need to seed the next generation of Amazon workers, and we're going to put some serious money into this. And that's what they're doing. When I talk to our administrators, they haven't even heard of this. And I'm not, again, I don't want to blame, but how do we not know? A town like Torrington, Jacque, right? We are diverse. We have money issues. We're not an economically wealthy town. We are much like the towns that my daughter or the demographics that my daughter's working in East LA. That's where Amazon's looking to put the money. How do we not even know that that's there? That's a problem for me. Okay, it's a problem for me, and it's a problem that no one else is even talking about. That there's money out there that companies are looking for their own self-interest. Okay, it's not simply because they're do-gooders. They're looking for their own long-term health and development of a workforce. They're putting serious money into the kinds of stuff that we should be doing. Anyway, that's kind of why we go back to City Council to bang the drum again to try to get support for this.
Well, Paul, I do, because unfortunately we're running out of time here on
figures. But, I made a note to myself, give short answers, and of course I blew it with the first one. So
because this just gives me another excuse to do Paul Cavagnero Part 2. City Views.